April 28th, 1869, near Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, in open desert. Patrick Joyce plants his boots between two ties as a flatcar rolls past at a slow walk and a 560-pound iron rail slides toward the edge above him. If he mistimes the catch by a second, it comes down on his foot or his skull. 7 other Irishmen wait behind him for the next one. Behind them, hundreds of Chinese labourers move forward with bars and spike mauls. By nightfall, this crew intends to lay 10 miles of iron by hand, a record that has never been broken since. Right now, nobody knows if their bodies will hold out that long. This is how a gauge bar and 8 men's hands set the standard the whole country still runs on. How does a rail crew move 4 million pounds of iron across a desert and still call it a job for 8 men? The answer starts 6 years earlier, when Congress fixed the gauge of the Pacific Railroad at exactly 4 feet 8.5 inches. Southern railroads ran 5-foot track, northern lines a dozen widths in between. A single mismeasured rail, repeated for 60 miles, could leave a locomotive with nowhere to run. Confederate rail lines had suffered badly from mismatched gauges during the war just ended. The track gang's job was to turn a paper number into nearly 2,000 miles of physical fact, one rail length at a time, without a single foot of drift. Foreman George Coley kept the time book that day. In it, he recorded 8 names: Michael Shea, Patrick Joyce, Thomas Daly, Michael Kennedy, Frederick McNamara, Edward Killeen, Michael Sullivan, George Wyatt. Each man was paid 4 days' wages for 1 day's work. Behind them stood the real workforce, Chinese labourers who made up roughly 4 out of every 5 men on the Central Pacific by this point in construction. They had not learned this trade from any manual. They had learned it rail by rail, under foremen who corrected a bad angle before it became a bad mile. Watch their hands and not their faces. That is where this record was actually being set. The work began before sunrise. A train of 16 flat cars loaded with iron for 2 miles of track was pushed to the front. Men climbed onto the cars and threw off kegs of bolts and spikes, punched out the side stakes and rolled the rails free. A reporter on the scene that day described it as a noise like the bombardment of an army. Small handcars then carried material forward in 6-man crews, each under a white foreman, feeding rail forward without a pause. Each car carried 8 pairs of 30-foot rails. A cleared train of 16 cars had to be replaced within minutes, or the line behind it stalled. 2 men worked the iron gauge bar behind every pair of rails. If the gauge drifted by even a small error, a locomotive wheel risked riding the flange wrong and coming off the rail. There was no margin for approximation here, only a bar, a measurement, and a spike driven true. The spikers followed immediately after, and a spike struck at the wrong angle did not simply bend. It could glance free of the maul entirely, and a missed swing at that speed could take off a finger. The rails came off the cars. The gauges set the width. The spikes went down, 3 blows to a spike, nearly 26,000 ties, 3,500 rails, 55,000 spikes. By the noon meal, 6 miles of new track lay behind them. After lunch, the grade climbed into Promontory Mountain, and the curves began. Straight rail will not bend itself around a slope. Crews forced each length over 2 wooden blocks and drove it into shape with a heavy hammer, 1 blow at a time. Close behind the rail layers, a straightener sighted the line by eye and waved the crew left or right until it ran true. This was slower work, and it demanded a different judgment than raw speed. A rail bent too far was discarded on the spot. A rail bent too little would not hold its line through a single winter. Most of the men who built this railroad left no names in any ledger. Union Pacific's own Irish and Confederate veteran crews had broken and rebroken the 1-day record for a full year before this. 4.5 miles, then 6, then 8, worked from 3 in the morning until midnight. Once a season's labourers scattered to other work or other countries, whatever they had learned about laying track under pressure went with them. Coley's time book survives only because his daughter kept it in a drawer for 60 years. The difference between an average gang and this one was not visible in any single rail. It showed up only in the sustained rate, nearly a mile of finished track every hour for 12 hours, without the pace ever breaking down into error. Ordinary track-laying crews of the era managed a mile or two in a full day. What separated Coley's crew and the Chinese labourers behind them was not strength. It was that every station along the line, unloading, gauging, spiking, bolting, ran in the same rhythm without anyone stopping to check the one ahead of it. A modern mechanised crew with a tie tamping machine and spike driver can match that daily distance now, with far fewer hands. A rail gang was not just labour, it was a visible argument. Irish immigrants and Chinese labourers, working side by side at a pace no single crew could manage alone, produced a track gauge that physically bound a divided country to one measurement, 4 years after a war that had exposed exactly how costly incompatible gauges could be. The 8 names in Coley's book and the hundreds left unnamed were together the proof that the argument had been settled in iron. By the early 20th century, steam-powered spike drivers and mechanical tie tampers had replaced most of what these men did by hand. The work did not disappear because it had failed. It disappeared because a machine could repeat the same motion at the same rate indefinitely, without needing 4 days' pay for 1 day's labour. Hand-track gangs, later called Gandhi dancers, persisted on branch lines and yard tracks for decades after, but never again at the pace, or under the stakes, of April 28, 1869. The 8 men in the time book survived the day. So did the record. 10 miles and 56 feet of finished track, tested that evening by running a locomotive over it at 40 miles an hour. Long before automated machinery could lay a mile of track in minutes, that distance depended on a gauge bar held steady, a spike struck true, and a rhythm that did not break for 12 hours straight. The rail is not a primitive tool. It is evidence that an entire country was once built at the pace of a hammer. These systems shaped the world quietly. If you'd like to see more of them preserved, consider subscribing, and tell us, which forgotten trade should we uncover next?